I stood there in my simple cotton dress, leaning on my late husband's wooden cane, watching my granddaughter raise her champagne glass high in the air. The crystal caught the light from the chandeliers above, scattering little rainbows across the white tablecloths. Sophie looked beautiful in her wedding gown, all lace and pearls, her blonde hair swept up like a princess. The kind of princess who'd forgotten where she came from. "And now," she said, her voice carrying across the vineyard reception hall, "I'd like to thank everyone who made this day possible." She paused, scanning the crowd of 200 guests in their designer clothes and expensive jewelry. My amazing parents who gave me everything. My wonderful new husband, Blake, whose family has been so generous. I felt a flutter in my chest. Maybe she'd remember me. Maybe after 3 years of ignored phone calls and returned birthday cards, she'd finally acknowledge the grandmother who used to braid her hair and teach her how to make sugar cookies from scratch. Sophie's eyes landed on me, standing near the back by the dessert table. For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker across her face. Recognition, maybe. Or memory of the little girl who used to climb into my lap and call me her best friend. Then she smiled. Not the warm smile I remembered, but something cold and sharp. "Oh, and I suppose I should thank my grandmother for coming," she said, and laughter rippled through the crowd. Even though she showed up looking like she raided a thrift store. More laughter. "Honestly, Grandma, couldn't you have made an effort? You're embarrassing us, standing there like a fat pig at a wedding." The words hit me like a physical blow. The room went silent for a heartbeat, then erupted in gasps and whispers. Some people laughed nervously. Others pulled out their phones, cameras already recording. I felt every eye in that hall turn toward me, watching the old woman with the cane and the homemade dress. My hands trembled against the wooden handle. Albert's cane. The one he'd carved himself 40 years ago, when his hip started bothering him. The one I'd held on to through everything that came after. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. The shame burned through me like fire. Not because of the dress or my weight or my age, but because this was my granddaughter. The baby I'd rocked to sleep. The toddler I'd picked up from daycare when her parents were too busy. The little girl who'd cried in my arms when she skinned her knee and told me I gave the best hugs in the whole world. Sophie turned away from me, already moving on to thank someone else, someone more important, someone worth her time. My son Clifford stood beside her, and I waited for him to say something, to defend his mother, to remember who raised him. But he just straightened his expensive tie and smiled at the guests, pretending nothing had happened. I gripped the cane harder, my knuckles white. The room spun slightly. I could feel the stares, hear the whispers, see the phones still recording this moment that would probably be on social media before the cake was cut. I turned slowly, carefully, my hip aching with each step. I would not run. I would not cry in front of these people. I had survived worse than this. So much worse than they could ever imagine. The back doors of the reception hall seemed a million miles away. Each step echoed in my ears. Someone giggled. Someone else whispered. I kept my chin up, kept my eyes forward, kept breathing even though my chest felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. I was 5 feet from the doors when they suddenly swung open. A man stood there, backlit by the evening sun. Tall, silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most of these guests' cars. The conversations behind me died instantly. I heard my son's sharp intake of breath, heard Sophie's confused whisper of, "Who is that?" Graham Weston stepped into the hall, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found me. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that held secrets and power and perfect timing. "Margaret," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "I hope I'm not late." None of them knew who I really was. None of them had any idea what was about to happen. And as Graham walked toward me, offering his arm like I was royalty instead of the family embarrassment, I realized that sometimes karma doesn't roar. Sometimes it walks through a door at exactly the right moment. Have you ever been humiliated by your own family in front of everyone? Drop a comment if this story is hitting close to home. Because what happens next nobody saw coming. To understand how I ended up at that wedding, you need to know about my husband Albert. And you need to know about our son, Clifford, who wanted everything his father never cared about. Albert Rowan built things with his hands. Not just furniture or birdhouses, but a real manufacturing company that made parts for tractors and farming equipment. Started it in our garage in 1968 with $200 and a dream that didn't involve getting rich. Just involved doing good work and treating people right. I can still see him coming home at night, grease under his fingernails, smelling like motor oil and sweat. He'd kiss my forehead and say, "Good day, Maggie. We helped 12 farms keep running today." That was success to him. Not the money, the purpose. Clifford grew up watching his father work 70-hour weeks. Watched him turn down expansion opportunities because he wouldn't lay off the workers who'd been loyal to him. Watched him drive the same pickup truck for 15 years while other business owners bought Cadillacs. And Clifford hated every second of it. "Dad's a fool," he told me once when he was 19, home from business school for Christmas. He could be making 10 times what he makes, but he's stuck in the past, worried about being nice instead of being smart. I should have seen it then. Should have recognized the hunger in his eyes that had nothing to do with feeding a family and everything to do with feeding an ego. Albert died in 2003. Heart attack at his desk, paperwork spread out in front of him, probably working on payroll to make sure everyone got their Christmas bonuses on time. He was 68 years old and had never taken a real vacation. The funeral was packed. 300 people showed up. Workers, suppliers, customers, people from town who barely knew him but respected what he stood for. They told stories about how Albert had given them jobs when no one else would, how he'd loaned them money interest-free when times got tough, how he'd closed the factory on Sundays because family time mattered. Clifford stood there in his expensive suit, shaking hands and accepting condolences. But I saw him checking his watch. Saw him taking calls outside. Saw him talking to lawyers in hushed voices by the parking lot. He wanted the company, and he wanted it now. "Mom," he said to me 2 days after we buried Albert, "we need to talk about the business." We sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where Albert had proposed to me 45 years earlier. Clifford had spreadsheets. He had projections. He had a whole presentation about modernization and efficiency and maximizing profit margins. Dad was sentimental, he said, not looking me in the eye. But sentiment doesn't pay bills. We need to make changes. Big changes. I trusted him. God help me, I trusted my own son. The lawyers came with papers. Thick stacks of papers with words like transfer of ownership and operational control and fiduciary responsibility. Clifford explained it all so fast, so confidently, his hand on my shoulder like he was taking care of me. "You'll still own 40%, Mom, but I need to run things my way. The company needs fresh leadership. Young blood. You understand, right?" I signed. I signed because he was my son, and because Albert was gone, and because I didn't know anything about running a manufacturing company. I signed because I believed family meant something. I signed my trust away to someone who saw dollar signs where his father had seen dignity. Ever trusted someone who turned your kindness into their advantage? Drop a heartbreak emoji if you know that feeling. The changes started immediately. Clifford fired the oldest workers first. Said they were too slow, too expensive, too stuck in old ways. Men who'd worked for Albert for 30 years found themselves on the street with 2 weeks severance and nowhere to go. They called me, crying, asking if I knew what was happening. I didn't. I really didn't. He moved the factory to a cheaper building across town. Bought new equipment that broke down constantly because it was made overseas by the lowest bidder. Cut corners everywhere Albert had been careful. Raised prices everywhere Albert had been fair. And when I tried to talk to him about it, tried to remind him about his father's values, he looked at me like I was a stranger. "Mom," he said, his voice cold, "this is business. If you can't handle it, maybe you should just stay home and let me work." So I did. I stayed home in my little house by the lake and watched my husband's legacy get torn apart piece by piece. Watched the company we'd built from nothing turn into something Albert wouldn't recognize. But that was just the beginning of Clifford's transformation. Because once he got a taste of power, once he saw what money could buy, my son disappeared completely. And the man who replaced him didn't have room in his life for a widow in a small house who reminded him where he came from. Sophie was born in 1998, 6 months after Clifford married Jennifer, a woman who wore pearls to the grocery store and corrected people's grammar at dinner parties. I drove 3 hours to the hospital the night Sophie arrived, my heart bursting with hope that maybe this baby would bring back the son I'd lost. She was perfect. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, with Albert's nose and my green eyes. I held her in the hospital room while Jennifer slept and Clifford made business calls in the hallway, and I whispered promises to her. Promises about cookies and stories and unconditional love. For the first 5 years, those promises held. Sophie was my sunshine. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Clifford and Jennifer would drop her at my house while they worked, and we'd spend the day making a mess in the kitchen. Chocolate chip cookies with too many chips. Lemonade stands that never made money because I let her give away free cookies. Finger painting on butcher paper spread across the dining room floor. "Grandma," she'd say, her little hand in mine, "you're my best friend in the whole world." Those words. I held onto those words for years after they stopped being true. The change started when Sophie turned 6. Clifford's business was booming by then. He'd expanded beyond Vermont, opened offices in Boston and New York. The money poured in like a flood, and with it came a new life. Big house in the wealthy part of town. Country club memberships. Private schools. "Mom, we've enrolled Sophie in Riverside Academy," Jennifer told me over the phone one Tuesday. "They have a wonderful after-school program, so we won't need you to watch her anymore." Just like that. 9 years of being needed, gone in one phone conversation. I still saw Sophie, but differently. Birthdays and holidays mostly. She'd arrive at my house in designer clothes, carrying electronic toys I didn't understand. She'd sit on my couch, polite but distant, answering my questions with one-word responses while texting friends on a phone that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "Want to make cookies?" I'd ask. "No thanks, Grandma. I'm not really into that anymore." "How about we go feed the ducks at the lake?" "That's kind of boring. Can I just watch TV?" I tried. God knows I tried. I'd mail her letters telling her about the birds at my feeder, about the flowers blooming in my garden, about memories of when she was small. She never wrote back. I'd call and leave messages, my voice cheerful even though my heart was breaking. She'd never return them. For her 10th birthday, I spent 2 weeks knitting her a blanket. Blue and green, her favorite colors back when she had favorite colors I knew about. I wrapped it carefully and drove to their house for her party. 50 kids were there. A bounce house in the yard. A magician. A petting zoo. Tables covered with presents in shiny paper and elaborate bows. I put my wrapped blanket on the pile and watched Sophie open gifts. American Girl dolls. iPads. A bicycle that probably cost $1,000. When she got to mine, she pulled out the blanket and stared at it. Then she looked at her mother. Jennifer's smile was tight, embarrassed. "How handmade," Jennifer said. "Isn't that sweet, Sophie?" Sophie dropped it back in the box without a word and reached for the next present. I saw her lean over to her best friend and whisper something. They both giggled. I left before the cake. If you think love and humility matter more than money, type love in the comments. The teenage years were worse. Sophie developed her mother's sharp tongue and her father's cold indifference. When she made the honor roll, I'd send cards with $20 tucked inside. She never mentioned receiving them. When she got her driver's license, I called to congratulate her. She let it go to voicemail. I showed up at her high school graduation, sitting in the back row because I wasn't invited to sit with the family. Watched her walk across the stage in her cap and gown, beautiful and confident and completely unaware I was there. After the ceremony, I waited by the exit, hoping to give her a hug. She walked right past me. Not because she didn't see me, but because she did and chose not to stop. I watched her get into a Mercedes with her friends, laughing about something I'd never be part of. That night, I sat in my kitchen and cried for the first time since Albert died. Cried for the little girl who used to think I hung the moon. Cried for the relationship I'd lost to money and status and a world where grandmothers in simple houses weren't worth a second glance. I sent her a graduation gift anyway. A photo album I'd made, filled with pictures from her childhood. Sophie at 3, covered in flour from our baking. Sophie at 5, feeding ducks at the lake. Sophie at 7, asleep on my couch with cookie crumbs on her shirt. The album came back 3 weeks later, unopened, with a note from Jennifer. Sophie is decluttering for college. She asked us to return this. I put the album in my closet, next to Albert's cane and his old work shirts that still smelled like him. And I realized something that hurt worse than any insult could. I'd lost both my son and my granddaughter to a life where people like me didn't fit anymore. Where love wasn't measured in cookies and time, but in price tags and appearances. Where being real was the same as being worthless. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in March 2019. I was feeding the birds on my back porch, watching them fight over sunflower seeds, when Clifford's name lit up my cell phone screen. We hadn't talked in 4 months. Not since Christmas, when I'd shown up at his house with homemade presents and he'd thanked me without looking up from his phone. So seeing his name surprised me enough that I almost dropped the phone in my coffee. Mom? His voice sounded wrong. Strained. I need to talk to you about something important. Is everyone okay? Is Sophie? Everyone's fine. It's about the business. He cleared his throat. There's been some complications. Complications. That's what he called it when his expansion plans crashed into reality. When his aggressive growth strategy hit a market downturn. When his expensive lifestyle collided with actual business sense. He showed up at my house that afternoon, looking older than his 48 years. His suit was still expensive, his watch still gleamed, but his eyes were different. Desperate. The company's in trouble, he said, sitting at my kitchen table where he used to do homework as a boy. Bad trouble. We expanded too fast, took on too much debt. If we don't get an injection of capital, we're going to have to declare bankruptcy. My stomach dropped. Your father's company? Bankrupt. It's not Dad's company anymore, Mom. It's mine, and I'm trying to save it. He pulled out papers, more papers, always papers with these people. There's a buyer interested. A big manufacturing conglomerate out of Chicago. They want to acquire us, but they need full ownership to make it work. What does that mean? It means I need your 40%. He looked at me directly for the first time in years. I need you to sign over your shares. Temporarily. Just until we stabilize things. Something in my chest tightened. Albert left me those shares for a reason. Albert's dead, Mom. The words came out harsh. Then he softened. I'm sorry. But this is the real world. Either we sell now on good terms, or we lose everything in bankruptcy. Your shares will be worthless anyway. At least this way, you'll get something out of it. How much? He named a figure. $50,000. For 40% of a company Albert built from nothing. A company that, when Albert died, was worth 20 times that amount. That's all I get? After everything your father. After everything Dad what? Clifford's voice hardened. After he refused to grow? After he turned down deals that could have made us all rich? After he chose being liked over being successful? He leaned forward. I've built this company into something real, Mom. Something that matters. And I'm not going to let it die because you're stuck in the past. Would you forgive your own child if they betrayed your family's legacy? I signed. Not because I believed him, but because he was my son and he looked so broken, and I didn't know what else to do. The paper said temporary transfer and pending restructure, and a lot of other words that probably meant something important to lawyers. Thank you, Mom. Clifford said, already standing, already leaving. This is going to save us. You'll see. 3 weeks later, I saw the article in the business section of the newspaper. Rowan Manufacturing acquired by Weston Industries for $12 million. $12 million. Not the $50,000 he'd promised me. $12 million. I called him 17 times that day. He didn't answer. I drove to his office, but the receptionist said he was in meetings. I went to his house, but the gates were closed and the intercom went unanswered. Finally, at 10 o'clock that night, he called back. Did you see the article? I asked, my voice shaking. Yeah. It went through faster than expected. You told me 50,000, Clifford. The company sold for 12 million. Silence. Then, the math is complicated, Mom. There were debts, loans, restructuring costs. Your percentage after liabilities came to about 50,000. The lawyers explained all this in the paperwork. I want to talk to the lawyers. They're my lawyers, Mom. They work for me. His voice went cold again. You signed the papers. It's done. You should be grateful you got anything at all. Grateful? Your father built that company. I helped him build it. We sacrificed everything. And I turned it into something worth buying. Me. Not Dad with his backward ideas and his charity cases. Me. He exhaled hard. Look, I've got to go. Jennifer and I are leaving for Aspen tomorrow. Celebration trip. Clifford, please. Can we just talk about? The line went dead. I sat there in my kitchen, in the dark, holding a phone that wouldn't ring again. The silence pressed in around me like water. 40 years of marriage. 20 years of building a business. 16 years of raising a son. All of it gone for $50,000 and a dial tone. The next day, I called again. Number disconnected. I drove to the house. New security code on the gate. I sent emails. They bounced back. I sent letters. They came back marked, return to sender. My son had erased me. Not just from the business, but from his life. From Sophie's life. From everything. And the worst part? I wasn't even surprised anymore. People in town felt sorry for me after that. The widow who'd lost her husband's company to her greedy son. The grandmother living alone in that little house by the lake. Poor Margaret Rowan, they'd say, shaking their heads at the grocery store. Such a shame what happened to her. I let them believe it. Let them think I was barely scraping by on Social Security and that $50,000 that wouldn't last long. Let them bring me casseroles and offer to help with yard work and slip 20s into my hand at church. The truth was different. Very different. What nobody knew, what Clifford never bothered to learn because he was too busy spending money to pay attention to where it actually came from, was that Albert Rowan was smarter than anyone gave him credit for. Back in 1987, Albert met a young investor named Graham Weston at a manufacturing conference in Chicago. Graham was just starting out, looking for good companies to invest in. Companies with solid fundamentals and honest leadership. He saw something in Albert that the big shot investors missed. I like how you do business, Graham told him over coffee. No flash, all substance. That's rare. They made a deal. Graham invested $20,000 in Rowan Manufacturing in exchange for 5% of any future profits from expansion projects. It was a handshake deal at first, then made legal later. Albert used that money to buy better equipment, to weather a rough patch in the early 90s. Then Graham started making real money. Not from Albert's company, but from other investments. Tech stocks in the late 90s. Real estate. Startups that became huge. By 2000, Graham Weston was worth over $300 million. And he never forgot Albert Rowan. Your husband's investment was my first success, Graham told me at Albert's funeral. He believed in me when nobody else did. I won't forget that, Margaret. I didn't think much of it at the time. Just a nice sentiment from a rich man paying respects. But 3 months after Albert died, Graham showed up at my house with a proposal. He wanted to buy out Albert's shares in several ventures they'd partnered on over the years. Things Clifford didn't even know existed because Albert kept his investment portfolio separate from the manufacturing business. I'm prepared to offer you $2.4 million, Graham said, sitting in my living room. Albert's stake in our projects has grown considerably. He deserves to be fairly compensated, and so do you. $2.4 million. I nearly fainted. There's one condition, Graham added. Nobody can know about this. Not your son, not your friends, nobody. Albert and I kept our partnership quiet for tax reasons, and because it was smarter that way. I need you to do the same. I took the deal. Put the money in accounts Clifford never knew about, with banks in cities I'd never visited. Lived the same simple life I'd always lived because that's who I was. That's who Albert taught me to be. And when Clifford stole my 40% of Rowan Manufacturing for $50,000, I let him, because I knew something he didn't. Graham Weston was the one who bought the company. And as part of the deal, as part of the restructuring, Clifford was too arrogant to read carefully. Graham made sure I retained shares in the parent corporation. Not 40% of a small Vermont manufacturing company anymore. 5% of a $100 million industrial conglomerate. If you believe karma works in silence, drop a folded hands in the comments. I was 69 years old, living in a small house by a lake, and I was worth more than my son would make in 3 lifetimes. But I didn't want revenge. That's what people don't understand. I didn't want to watch Clifford suffer or see him lose everything like he'd made me lose. That wasn't how Albert would have handled it, and it wasn't who I wanted to be. Instead, I helped people. Quietly. The way Albert would have. When my neighbor's house needed a new roof, an anonymous donor paid for it. When the high school's music program faced budget cuts, a mysterious check arrived just in time. When the old factory workers Clifford had fired couldn't afford their medications, they found envelopes in their mailboxes with no return address. I lived simply, because I liked living simply. Grew my own vegetables because I enjoyed it. Wore clothes from thrift stores because they worked just fine. Drove the same car I'd driven for 12 years because it still ran. Money didn't change me. But knowing I had it changed how I slept at night. The years passed. 4 of them. For years of silence from my son and granddaughter. For years of holidays alone. Of birthdays nobody remembered. Of phone calls that never came. I made peace with it. Some families are broken beyond fixing. Some losses you just learn to live with. Then one afternoon in August 2023, my mailbox held something different among the usual bills and grocery store circulars. An ivory envelope. Expensive paper. Gold lettering. Sophie Rowan and Blake Whitmore request the honor of your presence at their wedding. I stood there by the mailbox, holding that invitation, and felt something crack open inside me. Not quite hope, not quite pain. Something in between. My granddaughter was getting married. And despite everything, despite 4 years of treating me like I didn't exist, she'd sent me an invitation. I went inside and sat at my kitchen table, the same table where everything had fallen apart, and I stared at that ivory card until the sun went down. Part of me wanted to throw it away, wanted to protect myself from more hurt, more rejection, more proof that I wasn't wanted. But another part of me, the part that still remembered a little girl with chocolate chip cookie crumbs on her face, whispered something different. Go. Not for revenge. Not to make a scene. Just to see her one more time. Just to say goodbye to the granddaughter I'd lost, even if she never knew that's what I was doing. I called Graham Weston the next morning. I'm going to need a favor, I said. And you're probably going to think I'm crazy. He laughed. That warm laugh I'd come to appreciate over the years of our quiet friendship. Margaret, after everything you've been through, I think you've earned the right to be a little crazy. So I RSVP'd yes to the wedding, marked the date on my calendar, and started preparing for a night I'd remember for the rest of my life. Though I had no idea just how memorable it would turn out to be. The morning of Sophie's wedding, I woke up at dawn. Couldn't sleep anyway, my mind running circles around what I was about to do. The invitation sat on my nightstand where I'd kept it for 2 months, the gold lettering catching the early light coming through my bedroom window. I made coffee the way Albert used to like it. Strong enough to wake the dead, he'd say. Sat on the back porch watching the lake turn from gray to blue as the sun climbed higher. The ducks were already out, fighting over breakfast. Same routine they had for years. Predictable. Safe. Nothing about today felt safe. I'd thought about this moment 1,000 times. Played it out in my head during sleepless nights. Would Sophie acknowledge me? Would Clifford pretend I didn't exist? Would Jennifer make one of her polite butt-cutting remarks about my clothes or my hair or the fact that I still drove a 15-year-old Honda? The dress I'd chosen hung on my closet door. Simple cotton, floral print, the kind you'd find at any department store for $30. I'd thought about buying something fancy. God knows I could afford it now. But that wasn't who I was. Wasn't who Albert raised me to be. Besides, showing up in designer clothes would raise questions I wasn't ready to answer. Albert's cane leaned against the wall beside the dress. I'd polished it the night before, rubbed oil into the wood until it gleamed. He'd carved patterns into the handle during long winter evenings. Flowers and birds and little geometric shapes that didn't mean anything except he'd been thinking about me while he worked. I picked it up now, felt its familiar weight. "Wish you were here," I whispered to the empty room. "You'd know what to say to them. You always knew." But Albert wasn't here. Just me and my choices, and a wedding invitation that felt like both an olive branch and a trap. Would you go if your family invited you after years of betrayal? The drive to the vineyard took 90 minutes. Long enough to change my mind a dozen times. Long enough to imagine turning around at every exit. But I kept going, hands tight on the steering wheel, Albert's cane on the passenger seat beside me like a companion. The vineyard was beautiful. Rolling hills covered in grapevines, a massive white tent visible from the road, cars already filling the parking lot. Expensive cars. BMWs and Mercedes and Teslas. My Honda looked like it had wandered into the wrong neighborhood. I parked in the back row and sat there for a moment, engine off, gathering courage I wasn't sure I had. A young couple walked past, laughing about something. The woman wore a dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. The man checked his Rolex, said something about being fashionably late. They didn't even glance at my car. I got out slowly, my hip protesting like it always did after long drives. Smoothed down my dress, gripped the cane, started walking toward the tent where my granddaughter was getting married, without really wanting me there. The ceremony had already started. I could hear music, voices, the rustle of 200 people sitting in white chairs under that massive tent. I slipped in through a side entrance, found a spot in the very last row behind a decorative column. Sophie stood at the altar in her wedding dress, and my breath caught. She was stunning, all grown up, 25 years old, and beautiful, and so far removed from the little girl who used to fall asleep in my lap that she might as well have been a stranger. Blake, her husband-to-be, looked at her like she'd hung the moon. I wondered if he knew about the family he was marrying into. If he knew about the cruelty that hid behind Sophie's perfect smile. Or maybe he did know and didn't care because his family had money too, and this was just how wealthy people treated the inconvenient parts of their lives. The ceremony ended. Rice throwing, laughter, a kiss that got applause. Then everyone moved to the reception area, another tent decorated with flowers that must have cost tens of thousands of dollars. Crystal chandeliers hanging from tent poles. Tables covered in silk and gold. A cake 6 tiers high. I followed at a distance, staying near the edges, trying to be invisible. Saw Clifford in his tuxedo, shaking hands and accepting congratulations like he'd accomplished something by writing checks for his daughter's wedding. Saw Jennifer in a gown that sparkled when she moved, air-kissing guests and laughing her practice laugh. Nobody noticed me. Not yet. I found my seat at table 18, the farthest table from the head table. Stuck in the back corner near the kitchen doors where the staff kept rushing in and out. My tablemates were distant cousins and family friends who clearly drew the short straw in the seating arrangement. "Are you with the bride or groom?" The woman next to me asked politely. "Bride," I said. "I'm her grandmother." The woman's eyebrows went up slightly, like that didn't compute. Like grandmothers of brides should be sitting somewhere more important than table 18 in the back corner by the kitchen. But she just smiled and turned to talk to someone else. Dinner was served. Fancy food in small portions. Speeches started. Blake's father talked about legacy and tradition. Clifford stood up, his voice booming across the tent, talking about how proud he was of his daughter, how she'd grown into such an accomplished young woman. No mention of the grandmother who'd raised her part-time for the first 5 years of her life. No acknowledgement that anyone else had contributed to who Sophie became. Then Sophie stood up with her champagne glass, and my heart started hammering in my chest. This was the moment I'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. The tent went quiet as Sophie tapped her glass with a silver spoon. 200 faces turned toward her, smiling, expectant. She looked radiant under the chandelier lights, her wedding dress catching sparkles like she was made of diamonds. Thank you all so much for being here, she began, her voice clear and confident. The voice of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. This day wouldn't be possible without so many incredible people. She thanked Blake's parents, thanked her wedding planner, thanked her bridesmaids, listing each one by name with a personal story that made everyone laugh. She was good at this. Polished. The kind of person who could work a room without breaking a sweat. I sat at table 18, hands folded in my lap, Albert's cane leaning against my chair. Part of me still hoped she'd mention me. Still believed that somewhere under all that polish and wealth, the little girl who loved her grandma's cookies might still exist. And of course, Sophie continued, scanning the crowd, I have to thank my amazing parents. She gestured toward Clifford and Jennifer at the head table. Mom and Dad, you've given me everything. The best schools, the best opportunities, the best life anyone could ask for. I wouldn't be standing here without you. Applause rippled through the tent. Clifford stood up, raised his glass. Jennifer dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, her diamonds catching the light. Then Sophie's gaze landed on me. For just a second, I thought I saw something flicker across her face. Recognition. Maybe even hesitation. My heart jumped. This was it. She'd acknowledge me. She'd say something kind, something that would make this whole painful evening worth it. Oh, Sophie said, and her tone shifted. Lighter. Almost amused. And I suppose I should thank my grandmother for coming. A few people laughed nervously. I felt my face flush hot, even though she showed up looking like she raided a thrift store. More laughter now, louder. Sophie smiled, playing to the crowd. Honestly, Grandma, couldn't you have made an effort? You're embarrassing us. The words hung in the air like smoke. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Just sat there gripping the edge of the table while 200 people stared at me. Then Sophie said it. The words that would echo in my head for weeks afterward. Standing there like a fat pig at a wedding. The tent erupted. Some people gasped. Others laughed, thinking it was a joke. Part of some family humor they weren't quite getting. Phones came out. I saw the red recording lights, saw people pointing cameras at me, capturing this moment for their social media feeds. My hands shook. The cane rattled against my chair. Every eye in that massive tent fixed on me like I was an exhibit in a museum. The old widow in the cheap dress who dared to show up where she wasn't wanted. Clifford looked at his plate. Didn't say a word. Didn't stand up for me. Didn't remember that I was the woman who'd raised him, who'd sacrificed everything so he could have opportunities his father never had. Jennifer whispered something to the woman next to her, and they both smiled. Comment respect if you believe elders deserve dignity. Always. Sophie had already moved on, thanking someone else, laughing about something else. The moment was over for her. Just a joke, just a little jab at the old woman who didn't matter. But for me, it felt like dying. I pushed my chair back slowly. My hip screamed in protest, but I ignored it. Picked up Albert's cane with trembling hands. Every step toward the back exit felt like walking through concrete. The whispers followed me. The giggles. The phone cameras still recording. Someone said, poor thing, but I couldn't tell if they meant it kindly or as another insult. I kept my chin up, kept my eyes forward. This wasn't the first time I'd been humiliated. Wouldn't be the last. But it was the deepest cut, coming from someone I'd loved so completely. The back doors were 20 feet away. 15. 10. I was almost free, almost out of that tent and into the cool evening air where I could fall apart in private when those doors suddenly swung open. A man stood there, backlit by the setting sun. Tall and silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most of the cars in the parking lot. His presence commanded attention in a way that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with power. Graham Weston had arrived. The tent went silent. Not the polite quiet of a speech, but the shocked silence of 200 people realizing something important was happening, and they didn't know what. Graham's eyes found mine immediately. He smiled, warm and genuine, the kind of smile that held secrets only the two of us understood. Margaret, he said, his voice carrying across that massive space. I hope I'm not late. Behind me, I heard Clifford's sharp intake of breath. Heard Sophie's confused whisper to Blake. Heard the rustle of 200 people shifting in their seats to get a better view. Graham walked toward me like the crowd didn't exist. Like the only person in that tent who mattered was the old woman with the cane and the thrift store dress. He offered his arm. And everything I'd planned, everything I'd told myself about just wanting closure, just wanting to say goodbye to my granddaughter one last time, all of it shifted. Because Graham Weston wasn't just my friend. He was the man who'd bought Rowan Manufacturing. The man who now controlled everything Clifford thought he owned. And he was about to remind everyone exactly who they'd been so eager to humiliate. Graham's arm felt solid under my hand as we walked back into the center of that tent. Every step echoed in the silence. 200 faces tracked our movement like we were actors in a play they hadn't paid to see. Clifford stood up from the head table, his face going pale. "Mr. Weston? I didn't know you'd be attending." "I wasn't on the guest list," Graham said smoothly. "But when I heard about this celebration, I felt it was important to be here." He looked around the tent, his gaze sharp, especially after learning how the Rowan family treats their elders. Sophie glanced at her father, confused. Blake whispered something in her ear. Jennifer's smile had frozen on her face like she'd been turned to stone. Graham guided me to the front of the tent, right next to the head table. I wanted to disappear. Wanted to tell him this was too much, too public. But his hand on my arm was steady, grounding. "For those who don't know me," Graham continued, his voice carrying easily without a microphone, "my name is Graham Weston. I'm the CEO of Weston Industries." He paused. "The company that acquired Rowan Manufacturing 4 years ago." The crowd shifted. People leaned forward. This was getting interesting. Clifford's jaw clenched. "Sir, I don't think this is the appropriate time." "When is the appropriate time to tell the truth, Clifford?" Graham's tone stayed pleasant, but steel ran underneath. "After your mother has been publicly humiliated? After your daughter called her a fat pig in front of 200 witnesses?" He let that sink in. "Or should we just let it slide like you've let everything else slide?" Sophie's face went red. "I was just joking. Everyone knows." "Everyone knows what?" Graham turned to her. "That you're cruel? That you inherited your father's talent for using people and discarding them when they're no longer useful." He shook his head. "I've known your grandmother for 20 years. She's one of the finest people I've ever met. And you just humiliated her for entertainment." The phones were back out now, recording everything. But this time, the cameras weren't pointed at me. Graham pulled a document from his jacket pocket. "Let me share something interesting with everyone here. When I bought Rowan Manufacturing, there were certain conditions. Certain shareholders who retained equity in the parent company." Clifford went white. "That's confidential." "It was confidential," Graham corrected. "Margaret asked me to keep it quiet. She didn't want attention. Didn't want anyone to know that when you sold your father's company for $12 million, you actually did your mother one favor. You made her very, very wealthy. If you believe truth always finds its way, give this story a like." The tent erupted in whispers. I stood there, Graham's arm still supporting me, and watched understanding dawn on my son's face. "Your mother," Graham continued, "currently owns 5% of Weston Industries. That's roughly $5 million in assets. She's also a major stakeholder in 3 other ventures we've partnered on over the years." He looked at Clifford. "The woman you stole from? She's worth more than you'll ever be." Sophie's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Jennifer grabbed Clifford's arm, her knuckles white. "But here's what makes Margaret special," Graham said, and his voice softened. "She could have destroyed you years ago, Clifford. Could have sued you for fraud. Could have used her wealth to make your life very difficult. But she didn't. Because unlike you, she values dignity over revenge." He turned to the crowd. "While your hostess was spending thousands on flowers and champagne, Margaret was anonymously funding the high school music program. While your host was buying vacation homes, Margaret was paying medical bills for the workers he fired. While this family was busy climbing social ladders, Margaret was actually helping people." Someone in the back started clapping. Then someone else. Within seconds, Half the tent was applauding. Not for Sophie or Clifford, but for me. The old woman in the thrift store dress, with more grace in her little finger than the whole head table combined. Clifford sank back into his chair. Sophie stared at me like she'd never seen me before. Maybe she hadn't. Maybe all she'd ever seen was what her parents taught her to see, the inconvenient grandmother who didn't fit their image. Graham squeezed my arm gently. Would you like to say anything, Margaret? I looked at my son, at my granddaughter, at Jennifer with her diamonds and her fake tears, and I felt something unexpected wash over me. Not anger, not triumph, just profound sadness for who they'd become. I loved you, I said quietly to Sophie. My voice cracked, but I kept going. When you were little, you were my whole world, and I would have given anything to keep being part of your life. I paused. But you chose money and appearances over love. And that's something you'll have to live with. I turned to Clifford. Your father built something beautiful. Not because it made him rich, but because it gave people dignity and purpose. You took that and turned it into a transaction. And you can't even see what you lost in the process. The tent was dead silent now. Even the staff had stopped moving. I forgive you both, I said. But I don't need you anymore. Graham offered his arm again. Shall we? We walked out of that tent together, my head high, Albert's cane steady in my free hand. Behind us, 200 people watched in silence. Some were crying. Some were smiling. All of them were recording. The story would be everywhere by morning. But for now, in this moment, I just felt free. The video hit social media before Graham and I even left the parking lot. Someone had live-streamed the whole thing, and by the time we reached his car, it had already been shared 2,000 times. Sophie Rowan calls grandmother fat pig at wedding. The headlines read, Millionaire exposes family's cruelty. Wedding toast goes viral for all the wrong reasons. Graham's phone kept buzzing. So did mine. A phone number I'd barely given to anyone. Old friends I hadn't heard from in years. Distant relatives. Even reporters wanting statements. I turned my phone off. You okay? Graham asked as he drove me home. Honestly, I stared out the window at the dark Vermont countryside rolling past. I don't know. Part of me feels lighter than I have in years. But part of me just aches. That's the part that still loves them, he said gently. Doesn't make you weak. Makes you human. We rode in comfortable silence for a while. Then he said, For what it's worth, Albert would be proud of you. The way you handled that, the grace you showed even when they didn't deserve it. That's strength. My eyes burned, but I didn't cry. I'd cried enough over the years. Thank you for being there. For showing up when you did. Margaret, I told you 20 years ago that Albert was my first real success. He taught me that business could have honor. Graham smiled. Protecting you from his son's cruelty? That's the least I could do. By the time I got home, the story had gone viral. 5 million views. 10 million. News outlets were picking it up. Talk shows were calling it the wedding toast heard around the world. My phone stayed off, but my email inbox exploded. Most messages were supportive. Stories from other people who'd been cut off by their families, who'd been humiliated by their children, who'd chosen dignity over revenge and wondered if they'd made the right choice. Your story gives me hope, one woman wrote. My daughter hasn't spoken to me in 3 years because I didn't approve of her husband. Seeing you stand there with your head high makes me think I can survive this too. If you've ever chosen peace over revenge, type strong in the comments. But not all the messages were kind. Sophie's friends defended her online, calling it a joke that was misunderstood. Jennifer gave an interview saying I'd always been dramatic and difficult. Clifford released a statement through his lawyer about family privacy and media exploitation. None of it mattered anymore. 3 days after the wedding, Clifford called. I'd turned my phone back on by then, mostly to handle the genuine messages of support. His name on the screen made my stomach clench. I almost didn't answer. Almost let it go to voicemail like he'd done to me so many times over the years. But something made me pick up. Mom. His voice was rough, like he hadn't slept. We need to talk. About what? About everything. About what happened at the wedding. About the company. He stopped. About us. I sat down on my back porch, watching the morning sun on the lake. What is there to talk about, Clifford? You made your choices years ago. I know. I did. And He paused so long, I thought the call had dropped. Then, I'm sorry. For all of it. For taking the company. For cutting you out. For not standing up when Sophie said those things. The apology felt hollow. Like words he'd rehearsed, but didn't really understand. Do you know what hurt the most? I asked quietly. Not the money. Not even Sophie's cruelty. It was watching you become someone your father wouldn't recognize. Someone who values things over people. Someone who forgot where he came from. Silence on the other end. I don't forgive you, I said. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I don't hate you either. I just feel sad for who you could have been. Mom, please. I need to go now, Clifford. I hung up before he could say anything else. Sophie never called. Never apologized. She deleted her social media accounts and apparently took a honeymoon somewhere far from the internet. Blake's family, reportedly, wasn't pleased about the publicity. According to one article I saw, they were concerned about their reputation by association. I wondered if Sophie was learning, in her own hard way, what happens when your entire life is built on appearances. What happens when the first real test of character goes viral and everyone sees who you really are. But that was her journey now, not mine. Graham called a few days later with a proposal. I'm restructuring some investments, he said. And I'd like your input on something. How would you feel about using some of your dividend income to create a foundation? Something that supports the kinds of things Albert cared about. What kind of things? Manufacturing apprenticeships, technical education, programs that give people real skills and dignity through work. He paused. We could call it the Albert Rowan Foundation. I cried then. Finally. The good kind of tears that come when something broken starts to heal. I think Albert would love that, I whispered. Then let's make it happen. 6 months after the wedding, I stood in front of a small crowd at the community college in Burlington. The Albert Rowan Foundation was awarding its first scholarships to 10 students pursuing careers in manufacturing and skilled trades. The students stood nervously in their best clothes, most of them first-generation college kids who'd never thought they could afford school. Their families sat in the audience, proud and tearful. I thought about Albert. About how he'd given people chances when nobody else would. About how he believed in the dignity of work and the value of treating people right. This was his legacy. Not the company Clifford sold. Not the wealth I'd accumulated. But the lives we could still touch, the opportunities we could still create. My husband once told me, I said to the crowd, that success isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in the difference you make in people's lives. I looked at the scholarship recipients. These students represent the future. Not because they'll all be millionaires, but because they'll build things that matter. Because they'll work with their hands and their hearts. Because they'll remember where they came from. After the ceremony, one of the recipients approached me. A young woman named Maria, whose father had worked at Rowan Manufacturing before Clifford fired him. Mrs. Rowan, she said, tears in her eyes, my dad talks about your husband all the time. Says Mr. Albert was the best boss he ever had. That he treated everyone like family. She held up her scholarship certificate. This means everything to us. Everything. I hugged her. This young woman I'd never met who carried forward the values Albert lived by. That evening, I sat on my back porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of orange and gold. The ducks were settling in for the night. Everything peaceful and ordinary, and exactly as it should be. My phone buzzed. An email from one of the viral video sites. They wanted to do a follow-up story, something about where are they now and redemption arcs. I deleted it. Some people thought I should have destroyed Clifford's life when I had the chance. Should have sued him into poverty, used my wealth and connections to make sure he paid for his betrayal. But that wasn't justice. That was just revenge dressed up in legal terms. Real justice was quieter. It was living well. It was helping others. It was building something that lasted longer than money or appearances or viral moments. If this story touched your heart, like, share, and subscribe for more real stories of quiet justice. I heard through the grapevine that Sophie and Blake were having problems, that Jennifer was drinking more, that Clifford's business was struggling without the Weston Industries connection he'd taken for granted. Part of me felt bad for them. The part that still remembered loving them before everything fell apart. But mostly I felt free. Free from needing their approval. Free from hoping they'd change. Free from carrying the weight of their choices like they were somehow my responsibility. The lake turned from gold to purple to dark blue as night settled in. I thought about calling Graham, telling him about the scholarship ceremony. But he already knew. He'd helped plan it, had been there in the background making sure everything went smoothly. Instead, I just sat there in the darkness, listening to the crickets and the distant sound of boats on the water. Albert would have loved this moment. The peace of it. The rightness of it. We did okay, I whispered to him, wherever he was. We built something that mattered. And it's still growing. The stars came out one by one, filling the sky with light that had traveled years to reach me. Ancient light from distant places, still shining, still beautiful. Sometimes silence is the loudest justice of all. Not because it's weak or passive, but because it refuses to play by the rules of people who value noise over substance. I didn't need to destroy my son to prove he'd wronged me. Didn't need to publicly shame my granddaughter any more than she'd shamed herself. Didn't need revenge, because revenge would have made me just like them. Instead, I chose something harder and more powerful. I chose to let go, to build something new, to help people who needed it, to live with dignity even when others had none. That's the lesson I want to leave behind. Not how to get even, but how to get free. Never underestimate the power of calm dignity. It's the sharpest weapon in a noisy world. And sometimes, the best response to cruelty isn't to fight back louder. It's to walk away with your head high, your heart intact, and your hands open to help the next person who needs grace. Because in the end, that's what separates us from the people who hurt us. Not money or power or public vindication, but the choice to be better than our worst moments. To love even when it's not returned. To forgive even when it's not deserved. And to know, deep in your bones, that living well isn't just the best revenge. It's the only revenge that actually heals. Thank you for being part of this journey with me. If Margaret's story of quiet justice and dignity moved you, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next inspiring story. Share this with someone who needs to hear that peace is more powerful than revenge, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories matter, and they inspire others who are walking similar paths. Until next time, remember, the loudest justice often makes the quietest sound.